Hello, my name is Mordechai Cohen. I'm a professor of Bible and Biblical Interpretation at Yeshiva University. And we are honored to have with us Professor Roger Ames of Beijing within the rubric of the Chinese-Jewish Conversation Project at Yeshiva University. Just a few days ago, we were honored to have Professor Ames deliver a lecture on Confucian philosophy and its meaning for our day, in addition to comparing that with the Jewish tradition. And so we're very honored and pleased to be with Professor Ames today to have a conversation between the Jewish and Chinese traditions. We wanted to follow up, Professor Ames, on the lecture you gave the other evening on Confucian ethics and philosophy and its meaning for our day. But first, I just wanted to give some of the background for the whole concept of the Chinese and Jewish conversation at Yeshiva University. We have found, speaking with you, speaking with other professors, intellectuals, and lay people within Chinese and Jewish traditions, that there's so much in common between our two traditions in terms of textual study, in terms of value, in terms of ethics. And that's really something worth delving into in greater depth. And so first of all, I did have some specific questions, but I first wanted to get some of your overall impressions of this project. You're familiar with it. We've spoken about it for quite a while now. And I think your perspective is especially valuable for us.
You and I met each other in Tel Aviv, where I had the opportunity to give some lectures on Confucianism. And what that encounter inspired, I think, was on both of our part, you know, a belief that these two traditions have a lot to say to each other. And so I was particularly glad, like you've carried the ball, you're putting this together, but to call it a Jewish-Chinese conversation, I think is really, as opposed to a dialogue, you know, that Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is so prominent in terms of the history of yeshiva and the influence he has had on contemporary Jewish studies, we sort of take his lead, that a conversation is something that is open-ended. A conversation is something that comes from the inside in both instances, but that is open to growth, to learning, to changing ourselves by virtue of activating differences, cultural differences. It's all very well, you know, that we immediately, as you say, we can see that the textual traditions, the intergenerational transmission of this, the thickness of the Jewish culture and the persistence of the Chinese culture that goes back to antique times. I mean, the classical times. I mean, the strength of these traditions, there's much in common, but there's also really important differences that that once activated generate a kind of diversity, generate a kind of hybridity, generate new questions and new ways of thinking and so on. So it's not simply communicating Confucianism to a Jewish audience or a Jewish philosophy, Jewish history to a Chinese audience, but rather it's a conversation.
Right, right. So I think that you referenced Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who within Yeshiva University was certainly a foundational figure intellectually, and the motto of our university is Torah Umada, which means Jewish learning and general learning. And that idea of the cross-pollinization is really essential. And Rabbi Soloveitchik stood for that, and he exemplified it in his writings. And that's really our model here. And I like what you say about the conversation, that it's ongoing. It's not just a one one-time encounter where you study something, but it's really continually growing based on an exposure to ideas, to different concepts. This is something within the Jewish tradition. We mentioned Maimonides, the 12th century philosopher, probably regarded as the greatest philosopher in Jewish history. Maimonides lived in a Muslim environment, and he wrote in Arabic, and he studied all of the Greek philosophers that had been translated into Arabic, and he created a Jewish philosophy, and he did it enriched by that encounter. And that's really what we're seeking here. And so I wanted to, first of all, get your general impressions of our school. We went to see the Beit Midrash, where Rabbi Soloveitchik gave the first lecture to women in 1976 in Talmud. And that's that's quite a long time ago. It's over 40 years ago now, and the school has developed since. I think it was wonderful that we saw the Chinese audience that we had, because Yeshiva University now has a growing Chinese population. So the time has really come for that Chinese-Jewish conversation at Yeshiva University. So I did have some specific kind of more academic, intellectual questions, but kind of your overall impressions from that evening that you had with us.
The first impression that I had when I went to Israel, we traveled around, we went to Jerusalem and so on, is the diversity that is Israel. And that Israel is not one thing. And that's my impression here too at Yeshiva, you know, that with the leadership of Rabbi Soloveitchik, that the idea of Jewishness in context, that when you think of China, China is a continent. It's not a country. The scale, one city in China, Chongqing, has 5 million more people than all of Canada, you know. And so what Jewish studies, the idea of it having its context with, I mean, Soloveitchik was a scholar of Western philosophy. I mean, he did Jewish studies, and his identity came out of Jewish studies. But what he was able to do was he was able to inform it by broad learning. And that's the Confucian tradition too. The hybridity, there's a persistent identity, but then the first wave of Western learning, Buddhism, comes in. And Buddhism has an enormous influence in changing Chinese thinking, but China also produces its own version of Buddhism. You know, Huayan, Sanlun, Chan Buddhism, these are distinctively Chinese versions. And so I think a person like Rabbi Soloveitchik, the example that you gave, where he is the first scholar to bring women into Talmudic studies. This is innovative. This is new. This is a different Judaism, you know.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, half of the population.
Sure. That's very important. Within the Jewish tradition, this goes back about a century. We have a school called Beis Yaakov. Beis Yaakov started in the beginning of the 20th century. In the teens and the 20s, it started educating women in Eastern Europe. And that's really a transformation within Judaism. And Rabbi Soloveitchik is one part of that. I was wondering if you could address, if you would like to address within Confucian learning, if you see a similar transition in terms of teaching women as opposed to teaching men exclusively. Was it, my understanding is that it was primarily, that teaching was primarily for men, and studying was primarily for men. At what point did that change, or did it ever change within the traditional Confucian setting? And how is it different, say, today within modern China and Confucian studies?
Well, this is where Soloveitchik is a man of his time, that what we're all addressing, like an issue of our day is gender, that, and it's everywhere. As you say, the Chinese tradition, one of the things that we learn by comparing our traditions is how radically differently we gender ourselves as human beings. That gender, there's certainly a sort of a physical aspect to the differences between men and women, but when it comes to gender, how strongly it is a social construct within a particular cultural area. And so, as you say, in the long Chinese narrative, the distinction is, in Chinese you say nei wai, is the inner and outer, that women are persons, but they haven't had access to the social, the educational, the political forum that is necessary to become fully human. And so if we look at gender discrimination within the Chinese tradition, it really has been that they've been kept at home. Having said that, one of the persistent themes, going all the way back to the mother of Mencius, was that the woman had a very important responsibility for educating the young children. And you meet many scholars in the Chinese world where the influence of the mother on their scholarship is just extraordinary. One of my teachers, I mean, he learned his Chinese at his mother's knee, and his Chinese was maybe the best Chinese I've seen in my career. I mean, he was magnificent in terms of writing.
Right.
So this gender discrimination that has been part of the long human history in our time is an issue that we have to address, and that Judaism is going there, that the Chinese tradition is going there. I think this is progressive. This is evolutionary.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, more broadly, what you feel, having studied Confucian philosophy and texts, ancient texts with their commentaries, and having taught this for decades, and having made a substantial impact on the world of Confucian scholarship, what do you feel that Confucian learning and ethics and philosophy has to give the broader world today? Obviously, my primary interest is in the Jewish world, but you've made the argument that Confucianism has something to offer the whole world, and I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that a bit.
My sort of instinct that these two traditions have something to say to each other really goes back to, I'm an 18-year-old kid. I go to Chinese University of Hong Kong for a year on an adventure, and I took early Bible studies, I took New Testament studies, and right away, and at the same time, I had this enormous privilege of being a student of a man named Lao Tzu Guang, who's we just put up a bronze statue to this man on that campus, so he's very much revered. And I studied with him Confucianism, but coming out of Bible studies, you could see immediately the immediate point of contact is a relational conception of person, that the human narrative is a narrative nested within narratives, and so the family is so fundamental, is so important. The community is so important. The interdependence of person. We're teachers. we can only be good teachers if we have good students. If we have great students, we're great teachers. You know, that there's an interdependence, and this is, you know, if your neighbor does better, you do better. There's a wisdom, you know, in these traditions that come out of the idea that human beings don't live their lives inside their skins. We live them, everything that we do is transactional, and the entry point for developing moral competence is family. We learn to love by being loved. We achieve an identity physically. We achieve an identity in terms of our roles in the world by virtue of our locus in family and community. And so when I was beginning that, the first instinct is to go to the synagogue and to try to see how can these two worlds be compared. So what we're doing today, for me, is sort of something that occurred to me, you know, 50 years ago, I guess, but something that I haven't had the opportunity to really explore. So for me, this is a wonderful opportunity.
I'm really delighted to hear that. I think that you bring so much, and our Jewish and Chinese audiences, when we heard you speak about these very values, it resonated because the notion of the centrality of family and community and that relational definition of a person, I think makes a great impact on your Jewish audience as well as your Chinese audience. There's a saying within Jewish tradition, who is a chacham, ezehu chacham, who is a wise person? And it says the person who learns from everyone, who learns from every person. And the follow-up, the footnote on that is, I've learned from everyone, one of the wise sages said that, but I learned the most from my students. And what you just said, you're not a good teacher unless you have good students. And I think that relational concept is very important. Now, I also wanted to ask you of some of the particular concepts that you developed, that you've explained, that I think are worth zeroing on some specifics. In particular, the concept of Ren and the concept of Xiao. There are conventional translations of Ren as benevolence or humanity, and Xiao as filial piety. Can you say something about your take on those translations and the need to offer different translations?
In the 19th century, there was an anti-Hobbesian missionary named James Legge, who went to Hong Kong maybe in the 1830s and spent 30, 40 years of his life translating the Chinese classics. And when Legge was translating, his classics are the shoulders on which 20th century, 21st century Sinology stands. I mean, we still very much read his translations critically, but he became the first professor of Sinology at Oxford when he returned to Britain. So he's a person of stature. But he took his translations of these Chinese terms from Joseph Butler, who was a Presbyterian theologian who lived about 100 years before Legge. And so this is where the word benevolence comes from. You know, it's a Christian virtue. He translated E as righteousness, which is a biblical term. I don't usually use the word righteousness in my everyday conversation. He translated Tian as heaven and was really perplexed. He said specifically, why didn't Mencius just use the word God, you know? And he used Dao, the way, Xiao, filial piety, pious again. And when you put all of those terminologies together, what you get is a Chinese variation on an Abrahamic framework. And so what has happened in the wake of James Legge is that China, in your library, the Chinese philosophy is not to be found under the philosophy rubric, it's to be found under religion. If you go to Stanford, you go to the religion department to study Confucianism. And so what we've done with this missionary introduction of Confucianism into the Western Academy, we have framed it in those terms. And so some people will say Roger's translations are radical, but for me, my translations are conservative. Radical is to take somebody else's tradition and transplant it and put it into a different framework. What I'm trying to do is to recover the original meaning of these terms. And so I use the oracle bones, I use the bronzes, I use the canons of the tradition, and try to recover in a nuanced and sophisticated way what these terms really mean. Let's just take one of these terms. You take the term Ren. The term Ren is, I translate as consummate conduct, consummate person. Con, that the character has the character for human being, but it also has the character for number 2 beside it. And so what this indicates is that our individuality is not something that you begin from, but something that you achieve, not exclusive of the relationships with other people, but by virtue of the quality that you're able to cultivate in those relationships. And so you become distinctive, Mordecai. You become even distinguished by virtue of the relationships you have in your family and your community. As I walk around yeshiva and I learn of all the relationships you have with the students of students and so on, you are paying attention. You're listening. You're trying to grow these relationships. That's Ren, you know. It's aspiring to be consummate, a consumma, as good as you can be in the relationships that locate you. Now, what is interesting, one of the most exciting things about working in the Chinese tradition are the recent archaeological finds. When we find that same character on the oracle bones, it's written in a different way. And so, not the oracle bones, on the bamboo strips, the Guodian bamboo strips, it's a character that indicates a body, and then underneath it is a heart mind. And so you say, well, we've lost that kind of duplicity. We've lost the doubleness, the duality of the term. But know that when we look at the oracle bones, the body is not simply a body, it's a pregnant body. It's a woman with child. Now, there's no intimacy in that kind of two-ness that is stronger than the relationship between a woman and a child, a woman with child. And so there's something beautiful about that. And so what I try to do is so the notion of Ren begins in the first promptings of family, you know. So Ren is not sort of a virtue that is somehow independent of family. It's a virtuosity that emerges out of the most intimate aspects of family.
Right. So I think that your interpretations are, and you mentioned this, and it always strikes me how generous you are to your critics. And
there's lots.
Well, okay, so I think that that's worth just putting into context, because you've made seminal studies of the Confucian tradition, and you've made a huge impact. And I think that I read in a volume of studies devoted to a back and forth with your philosophy. I mean, that says a lot, by the way, that people engage with your thinking, that means that you've changed the conversation. So people may disagree, but everyone agrees that you have sort of put down a challenge. What you have proposed, so propose an alternative. And I think to my mind, what you've just described and some of the interpretations that you gave here, and I remember first hearing in that lecture in Tel Aviv, your interpretation of Ren, to me, really hit home. In the Jewish tradition, there's a kind of tension between looking at the original intention of the ancient texts in their original context, in their original milieu in the ancient Near East, and then each generation trying to interpret them anew. And so there's a term that's well known now in literary criticism because it's become very popular. The term is midrash. Midrash comes from the word to seek, to uncover, to discover, and discover meaning within the text. And there's a story of Moses going up to the mountain, Mount Sinai, to receive the Torah from God. And God shows him an image that would happen more than 1,000, well over 1,000, maybe 1,500 years later. One of the greatest scholars, Jewish scholars of the beginning of the Common Era, was named Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva explained, he did a lot of midrash. He explained every word in the Bible in a new way. And Moses was transported to the back of the classroom of Rabbi Akiva, and he didn't understand what Rabbi Akiva was saying. And Moses was very distraught. And so one of the students asked Rabbi Akiva, "How do you know this, Master?" And he said, "It's a tradition from Moses from Mount Sinai."
Right. This is beautiful.
So then Moses felt better. Okay, then they're saying this in my name. But what that tells you about the Jewish tradition of learning is that this innovation, this creativity of interpretation is embedded within the system of interpretation. But it needs to be responsible to the text. It can't just be an innovation. And that's kind of the tension between tradition and innovation that I think I wanted to get your sense of this within modern China, because my sense is that over much of the 20th century, the Confucian texts, the ancient texts, were kind of put to the side where China tried to modernize, wanted to modernize. And the modern state of Israel went through and is going through this same situation where you can't just go back to the Bible and have an ancient state.
The politics of knowledge.
Right, but there's an endeavor to kind of integrate the ancient traditions into the modern world, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that as well.
Right. We talked about James Legge.
Yeah.
So here's this Scottish missionary who goes to Hong Kong, and we can be critical of him. Like I just said, he used Joseph Butler's theological vocabulary to translate China, and we can say, well, that is a grave distortion of the original text. But in his time, Legge was ostracized by the other missionaries in Hong Kong because he had the temerity to elevate Chinese classics to the same level as Western classics. And so, I mean, this was outrageous, you know, that in his time, on the one hand, we can say we have to get past a vocabulary that he introduced. On the other hand, we have to respect him as somebody who is revolutionary in his own time, that he is trying to overcome a condescension, a European condescension to Asia, very much in the mold of Hegel. And so when I am trying to recover I'm working on a lexicon of Chinese philosophical terms, bilingual, and I just finished the entry for Ren, and it's 30 pages long. You know, these terms are complex, but we have to try to allow this tradition to speak on its own terms. Over the last generation, with my graduate students at the University of Hawaii and now at Peking University, we've translated or retranslated many of the Chinese classics. And in so doing, the impetus are these recent archaeological finds. We're recovering texts that have been lost for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. We're recovering texts that are earlier versions of texts that we have today. Most exciting, hugely exciting for my students, for me, but probably the most important reason for retranslating them is to get past our own lexicon. Where people are critical of me, they'll say that my translations are creative. My argument would be that if you depend upon the lexicon that we have today, that's a lexicon that is freighted with Christian assumptions. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to operate within the context of the tradition itself. Right. And so what we're doing is we're looking for a new way of understanding these terms, but most important is not to substitute one more inadequate translation of the text to replace a painfully inadequate formula of translations, but rather is to insist that the student learn some Chinese. Wittgenstein says the limits of our language are the limits of our world. If somebody is serious about learning about Judaism, serious about learning about the Confucian tradition, you simply have to allow the tradition to speak for itself. And so these terms, Ren, the best translation of Ren is Ren, with second tone.
I think that, you know, everything you're saying resonates in terms of the Jewish tradition because there are now translations of the Jewish classics into English. There were translations into German, and before that into Arabic. But if you really want to understand the text, you need to know the original Hebrew or Aramaic, certainly. But that leads to another question I had. You refer often to an asymmetry between scholars of Chinese studies as opposed to Western traditions of learning. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. That one of the asymmetries is that from a Western point of view, we are using an Abrahamic framework to read the Chinese tradition. And so what we've done is we have located philosophy in religion. And that's not a...
you mean Chinese philosophy?
A Chinese philosophy into our shelves of religious texts. The word philosophy is not a neutral term. That people who teach sociology will say, I'm a sociologist, or history, I'm a historian. We who do philosophy are a bit reluctant to say, I'm a philosopher. That, you know, Aristotle perhaps, Maimonides, you know, that philosophy is a sign of respect. And to fail to appreciate the philosophical nature, there's nothing that is less in these Chinese texts than Kant. You know, it's not wisdom literature. It is a vision of the moral life, and it is profound. And to fail on our part to recognize that is an asymmetry. But there's an asymmetry that goes the other way, and this is history. In the second part of the 19th century in East Asia, beginning in Japan, where Japan was the most sophisticated culture at that time, a new language, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, using the Chinese characters, was developed in order to sync these Asian languages with Western modernity. That Western modernity was perceived, you mentioned this a moment ago, you know, that the Confucian classics have been overwhelmed by Western learning in the 20th century, as China aspires to modernity, as it aspires to science and democracy and these Western values. And so what happened was the languages themselves were changed to the extent that the Western educational system, from preschool through university, was imported wholesale into East Asia with a Western curriculum. And so the vocabulary that we use in philosophy when I speak Chinese is not really Chinese. It is a Chinese translation of modernity. And that's true in every subject. And the theories that we use to theorize, we ask the question, you know, is Confucianism an Eretaic, Aristotelian virtue ethic, or is it a sentimentalist, Humean virtue ethic? Using Western theory, Western categories to shoehorn the Chinese tradition into categories that we understand. And it's not simply us, it is the East Asians themselves. They are doing this. If we read Chinese literature, we read Western literature, we're both doing the same thing. We are using a Western conceptual structure to understand a tradition that is something different. And so this is the asymmetry that we're trying to.
I guess the challenge that we have is that the Western categories, as for us as Western educated people, they're kind of hardwired almost into our mind, and what you're aspiring to do is unhardwire, or is to rewire, to get a more subtle understanding. And I think, for example, this is something that resonates within the Jewish tradition, that I'll just give us an analogy, is that the modern state of Israel took Hebrew as its national language, the first language. The second language is Arabic. But Hebrew had been a language of scholarship rather than of real life for centuries, for well over a millennium. And when the founders of the State of Israel, actually it predated Israel, they tried to revive the Hebrew language, there was a vocabulary that was missing. And much of the modern vocabulary had to come from elsewhere. And many of these terms, so for example, the word information, informatia, it's from Russian. Universita, it's also from Russian. All of these conceptia, conception, all of these philosophia, these terms did not exist in Hebrew, and they had to be imported. But you're absolutely correct that it does kind of color the modern Jewish experience in Western terms, which is not unusual because, or it's not atypical within Jewish tradition, because the Jews had long lived among other peoples. So they embraced, for example, Maimonides wrote his magnum opus called The Guide of the Perplexed, Dalalat al-Hayrin in Arabic. He used Arabic philosophical terms, and those were introduced into Hebrew by translators of Maimonides. And those became embedded in the language. So it was a gradual process of bringing in other terms and concepts. But I think what you're arguing for is that that has its place, and it's given us a new way of appreciating Confucianism within those Western categories. But what you're arguing for is a new Confucianism that's in a way more true to the Confucian spirit. But the question remains how to address the modern challenges. And I suppose as my kind of final question, what do you see as the possibilities? Because Confucius was dealing with different problems in his day, and we are dealing with Western problems. And what do you see as the promise for Confucianism in the 21st century?
I mean, just to go back a moment to your like Classical Chinese is a language, a written language. It's not a transcription of speech. And so in many ways, you know, things you say about Hebrew, you know, it is a tradition that lives in the lives of the people. I mean, we can talk about books all we want, but at the end of the day, these are living traditions. Right. In Chinese, you say Dao Bu Yuan Yuan, you know, that Dao, this way of living is not far from people. Like a healthy language, the English language, the story of the English language is all about hybridity. It's all about absorbing language, doing what Hebrew has done, doing what modern Chinese has done in some way. So the problem that I'm referencing is not the growth of the language, the healthy imbibing of terminologies that come from outside. This is the way that languages grow. A sealed culture is a dead culture, and the most fecund, the most fertile is the echo tone between cultures. This is why Jewish-Chinese conversation is such a good idea. But what I'm saying is that what we have to do first is recover the Chinese tradition on its own terms, without overriding it with cultural importances that are not its own. Having done that, then we're in a position, getting past the asymmetry, then we're in a position to have the conversation. And so that's my point there. And the second point is that in one generation, we have witnessed a sea change in the economic and the political order of the world, that East Asia has risen, and the world will not be the same. And so the question is, what about world culture? And this is where Judaism and Confucianism, perhaps marginalized, you know, within a world where liberal values are predominate, that the kind of problems that we face today, global warming, environmental degradation, international terrorism, nuclear proliferation, food and water shortage, income disparities, all of these problems are not issues that single actors can solve. These are problems that only a community of nations can solve, that we have to collaborate, we have to respect each other, we have to, in Chinese you say 和而不同, to seek harmony and difference rather than uniformity, that we have to appreciate our diversity and at the same time cooperate in order to address the pressing issues of our time. And so my interest in Confucianism is not to say things that Chinese people like to hear me say. My interest in Confucianism has to do with the fact that I'm persuaded that this tradition, and not that Confucianism can solve all of the world's problems, but it deserves a place at the table that it has not had, that it has values that grounded in family, community, grounded in the idea of a world community that we need in our time if we're going to pull back from a point of no return. So in a generation where we've seen this sea change in the economic and political order of the world, what about Mordecai? What about the cultural order of the world?
Thank you very much, Professor Ames, for a truly informative conversation. This has been a wonderful foundation of the Chinese and Jewish conversation at Yeshiva University, which we envision will go far beyond the walls of our university. Thank you very much.